As we're going through this, a kind of a good rule of thumb is if you hear something and you go, I don't remember that at all, I don't even have a clue, feel free to ask a quick question. But if it's something that's going to take longer to get into, I'm more than happy to talk with any of y'all via email, callen@richmont.edu. If you're, you know, I'm happy to talk to you in the hall. I'm happy to talk to you after class, just because I know there's just so much information to cover. So, but I'm here if you need me. And believe it or not, you know a lot more of this than you think you do. I was told you've had access to them. I'm not sure where that would be. They're not in camp. This is.
They're on base camp now. Yeah, they're on base camp.
Base camp. There you go. I don't know what base camp is, but there you go. They're there. So if you still happen to have slides from when you took the class with me, there's very similar. It's same sort of content, just kind of narrowed down, hopefully. So here we go. So psychological tests. This is just, we're talking about tools that we use to obtain information. It's talking about being systematic in our way of evaluating our clients and gathering information about their behavior. Start with the history stuff, because this kind of stuff shows up on licensure exams, and you know, it's stuff that you'll probably forget shortly thereafter, and that you'll be okay. But let's pay attention and remember it for now. The people we give credit to first for testing goes back 2,500 years ago-ish to the Greeks. We're not 100% sure what they were using it for, but best guess is that it was something military related, helping figure out where some folks go, who's front line, who's placed in a leadership role, those kinds of things. The Chinese, we know a little bit more about it. About 2,000 years ago, they were using this as a way to figure out who would get to have a role in government. So they were basically civil service entrance exams. But they're physically grueling tests. They were not paper and pencil tests so much that you're used to taking now. So Seguin, if I'm butchering French, I'm sorry. He is the one that is credited with really starting to study mentally retarded children. We now say intellectually deficient ID, but you'll see in the medical community, mentally retarded is still used as a term. It is not meant as a pejorative term. It is used as a descriptive term. But he was trying to figure out how to determine whether or not, especially children, were having difficulties intellectually or were not. And so then a little bit later, we had to determine not just were people in a category of mental retardation or not. They started saying, well, we need levels. We need to understand that there are different groups. So this is where testing kind of started to grow out of. Sir Francis Galton, put a star by it, highlight it, whatever. And then, you know, the father of psychological testing, totally an NCE kind of question there. This is the guy that gets that title. He's the one that invented the first battery of tests. He's also the one that came up with this statistical technique called correlations. So he's the one you have to thank for that. But the idea was here is that he was looking at this data and trying to figure out how things were related. So correlations. It grew from that. He was trying to understand human genetics and heredity and what got passed on through the generations. And he had rating scales and questionnaires. So this was starting to look more like what we associate with testing. And you can see we're still 1822, 1911. So, German fellow Wilhelm Wundt was the person that we credit as having the first psychological laboratory. That was in Leipzig, Germany. He's another name that tends to show up on these things. Ebbinghaus. Do you remember what Ebbinghaus what's about memory? So he's actually credited with studying memory and coming up with this idea of the forgetting curve, not the remembering. So the idea here is that we tend to remember things that we studied first and things that we studied last, and forget all the stuff in the middle. So in modern terms, primacy and recency. So when you're studying, you'll remember whatever was first today. I think that was Bill Doverspike in ethics, and you'll remember my class. The rest of it, you'll have to go back and restudy. But so this forgetting curve is credited with him. So memory, Ebbinghaus. All right, Cattell. There's several Cattels in testing history. The first of which, James Cattell, is an American. So University of Pennsylvania opened up a testing laboratory there. He's using lots of stats in his psychological testing, so this is getting more reliability and validity associated with it. So he is the one that started working with developing the mental measurements, and the mental measurements yearbooks are growing from all of this as well. Y'all remember that, the big encyclopedia of tests. Charles Spearman is another name that you all want to remember. Spearman, two-factor theory of intelligence. So this is where taking this idea of intelligence and broadening it and going at a deeper level of understanding of what makes people intelligent, what helps people understand things and learn things. So this is just kind of pushing that idea along. Binet. Y'all remember Alfred Binet? You know, most of you would associate that, I would assume, with the Stanford-Binet. But Alfred Binet is the Binet part of the Stanford-Binet. In 1904, the French government said that they needed someone to study feeble-minded people that we would call ID or mentally retarded in the medical community, and needed to understand how to categorize folks and understand who fits where. And so Binet was the one that they charged with this. So he created a test, and it was a 30-question IQ test, first person to use that term. And so this was our first intelligence test. And Frank Parsons was about the same time, a little bit later there. This is another father. This is another father. Make sure that you, yeah. Unfortunately, not too many mothers or sisters or, but another father. This is the father of vocational guidance. So all you guidance-minded, career-minded folks, make sure this sticks out in your head. Parsons is another father figure, vocational guidance. Who is our other father figure? Oh, it's already gone, isn't it? Golden, there you go. So, all right. So, Parsons was here in the States as well. He was in Boston. So, all right. Now, Thorndike is another one that's using this newly discovered technique of the correlation coefficient. And so he's trying to figure out, along with his career-minded mindset and vocational mindset, of what are the associations we can make between people's interests and abilities, and how do we measure those things. So he's using this correlation coefficient, which was a new statistical technique to create better tests to do that. So, yay. All right. So 1916, so still a couple years ago, 101, 102 years ago, Louis Terman was working at Stanford University, and he'd been looking at Alfred Binet's test that was used to measure intelligence over in France, and said, hey, this is a pretty decent test, but we can do better. And so he and other researchers at Stanford created a new version of that test, and because they wanted to give credit where credit was due to Binet, they called it the Stanford-Binet Test. And that is, we are in the 5th edition of that test today. So it was just a much more advanced, much more in-depth intelligence test than what had previously been out there. So, all right. Bless you. Yerkes. If you've been around Emory, you might recognize this name because of the Yerkes primate lab. But Robert Yerkes, here in the States, developed the Army Alpha and Army Beta. What was going on 1917-ish? World War I. So the country had enlisted more people, drafted more people than they knew what to do with, quite literally. They weren't sure how to divide these people up into various categories, who was going to be infantry, who was going to be in commanding officer roles, and where to send people. So they needed tests to figure that out. So they created the Army Alpha, which was a primarily verbal test. And then they realized that there are people that were still quite intelligent that didn't know how to read. So they created a nonverbal inventory called the Army Beta that was primarily nonverbal, entirely nonverbal. And so they used these tests to help sort out all these enlisted men. So that and versions of that were used for quite some time afterwards. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was still being used more on an individual level. So it stuck around for quite some time. In the 1920s, Arthur Otis created another intelligence scale. This one was one of the first group administered, or was the first group administered IQ test outside of the military. So the Army Alpha and Army Beta were both group administered IQ tests because they would have a whole bunch of enlisted men sitting in a room like this, hand out a whole bunch of these tests. This was the first one that was developed for outside the military. And it was geared towards students in schools, and primarily elementary-ish and middle school age students. So, you all heard of the Otis Lennon test? Mm-hmm. That's still around, based off this. So why do we do this? Here are some of the reasons. But whenever you're doing counseling, you are going to be doing some sort of assessment and some sort of appraisal. This helps us with our diagnosis, it helps us with our treatment planning, placement, all kinds of various reasons. These are just a few of them. All right. So in this counseling process, there will be formalized assessments that y'all do, like you might hand a client a rating scale and ask them to rate how depressed they are, or how anxious they are, or what their interests are. But there's also informal assessments that we're always doing, like we're watching behavioral observation, looking around the room, seeing who's alert and who's on Facebook and who's, we're looking at our clients and making all these observations. And while that's not a paper and pencil assessment that we're handing them, that's still assessing them and assessing how they're doing. And so you will always be doing some form of assessment if you're doing counseling. If you have limited skills in assessment, whether it's be formalized or informal assessments, then we tend to make more mistakes in diagnosis and treatments. And when we make mistakes in diagnosis and treatment, not only do the clients not get what they need, which is probably the worst aspect of it, they tend to leave and not come back. We tend to have, it tends to be a breakdown in the counseling process. The best predictor of a negative outcome is when we underestimate the severity of the client's problems. So, the idea here is we want to be assessing them informally in terms of through the interview process and asking them questions about themselves, and as they're telling their story, and as y'all have experienced sitting across from clients and watching them, as they're talking to you and you're reading their body language. That's part of it. And then adding in this paper and pencil assessment side of it as well. The combination of the two gives us more information so that we can better estimate how severe the client's symptomology actually is, which helps us accurately treatment plan. So we have the structured, when we're talking about diagnostic interviews or clinical interviews, we can have structured interviews where you're taught to do an interview exactly the same way every time. You might, places that I've done structured interviews, they gave us a piece of paper and then have the questions listed in order of what we were supposed to say. And you say the same questions every time in the same order in the same way. You have semi-structured where you have an idea of all the questions that you need to say, and you're a little bit more lax about when you ask a question. You just make sure you get to all those areas, versus unstructured tends to be more of the, so what brings you in today, and allowing the client to lead in that. And you still are gathering information, but you're letting the client do a lot more of that leading. So during the initial interview or clinical interview, the two main things that we're going to talk about, there's a lot more to it, obviously. Y'all have done these, you know, there's more, is the mental status exam and suicide assessment. So, you know, we're also doing things like substance abuse and assessments and all kinds of family history, all kinds of other things. When we're talking about the mental status exam, these are the main categories that we're talking about there. I don't need to read them all to you. If you're kind of running into some brain fog on some of these, I would encourage you to go back and read through these again, because they're not just good kind of things for licensure exam sort of questions, but it's an important part of assessing intakes or the intake process with our clients. So for suicide assessment, these are the two that Dr. McGee threw up there for us in the class. I had not heard of the PIMP way of doing things. I liked it. You know? We're keeping the PIMP in there. So y'all probably recognize that person. That's the one that shows up in multiple classes. It was in the class you took with me. It was at least one of the classes you took with me, if not multiple. Cell, we use that, yeah. All right, yeah. We won't go into that trauma right now. But when you're in one of those stressful situations and you can't remember what all those letters stand for in sad person, and you're trying to do a suicide assessment, you probably can remember PIMP. You know, might even lessen some of that stress there. You know, but PIMP is just plan, intent, means, prior attempts. These are the basic things that we have to understand to understand the severity of the situation and the safety of our clients. So, you know, when you get to this question on the licensure exam, giggle a little bit and, you know, lighten the mood and move on. All right. So, licensure exams love terms just as much as they do names. Appraisal, assessment are pretty much interchangeable. Appraisal is just the process of measuring or estimating attributes of an individual. So remember, we're talking about attributes of a person, characteristics of a person. We're not talking about measuring the person. Okay. I make that distinction because I know y'all know that, but that's the kind of distinction that they might make in a test question. Are you measuring the person? No, you're not. You're measuring characteristics of the person. Psychological tests this is another one that shows up. It's just a systematic way of measuring a sample of behavior, or a systematic way of measuring behavior. Norms, it's not a good term. It's just the average normal performance from the standardized sample. So what is the average performance? So, all right. So then we have all types of scores. Yay! We've got raw scores and weighted scores and converted scores and all these things. So raw scores, it's just what they actually ticked on the exam. You know, yes, no, true, false. You know, you added up some points, 10. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the number from the exam. It's not adjusted in any way whatsoever. A weighted score talks about in some exams that you take, some of the questions are going to be worth more than other questions. And so if a score is weighted more heavily, it's worth more. It counts more on there. There's a children's inventory, personality inventory, that some of the items are weighed twice as much as others. Then you have converted scores, where you're taking these raw scores, what they actually entered on the test, and converting that into a useful score that you can compare to a normative sample in some way. So you can say, you did this, and that compares to humanity in this way. So we can determine, is that normal? Is that below? Is that above? Is that good? Is that not? So we have, when we're talking about numbers and number systems and norms, we have ordinal and norm referenced and criterion referenced. Ordinal, we're talking about ordinal norms. We're talking about developmental scores. This is going to be our age equivalent and grade equivalent scores. These are not good for using for comparison sakes. They're still included in a lot of things like achievement tests, especially. You might see some of those things come home from your kids that took things at school. They're just not very accurate ways, statistically speaking, of comparing data. The American Psychological Association actually encouraged psychologists to put statements in their reports a few years back of, this is not a good way in comparison. So, but they're still around. Norm referenced or interval scores, these are our z-scores and our t-scores. So you all remember z-scores and t-scores. We're going to talk about them in a minute. This is a way to compare this individual score to a standardized sample. And then we've got our Criterion-Referenced Tests, or our Criterion-Referenced scores, where we take an individual score and we compare it to a standard or a criterion, a cutoff, and to help determine whether or not that individual scored high enough to be above the cutoff or below the cutoff. So, all right, so we have a few statistical terms here. Hang in there with me, it's not too bad. You've done more already with research methods. So descriptive statistics is just describing a collection of data. Inferential statistics is, makes observations, or makes population observations from samples. So those are just kind of some of the baby stats that you might see show up on their sample or standardization sample. This is just the idea that when we're studying groups of people, we can't study the whole population. Like if we want to study depression in college age individuals, we can't just go test every college age individual on the planet. That's just not doable. So we go and pick a group of them, a sample. So, standard scores, it's taking that raw data and transforming it into a score that fits within the normal curve that we're going to talk about in a second here, and helps us be able to use that individual score in a meaningful way and understand how they compare to everyone else. So usually we're talking about that in terms of comparing it in terms of standard deviations from the mean. There's the beautiful bell curve or the normal curve. So the idea here is that if you get enough data, if you get enough people, enough data points in a population, the data is going to fall out into this this curved format, where most people are average, which is why it's called average. And so that's why the middle, the little U there in the middle means mean. Right there in the middle is where most people in the population are. So if you look at a standard deviation above and a standard deviation below, that's still considered average, that blue area there. So you're probably not going to need to know this to 0.1%. You're more likely to need to know it rounded to the nearest whole number. So you'd say 34%, or for that first standard deviation above the mean, they might ask you to figure that out. But as you're thinking about this, as you go further and further away from the mean there, you're getting more and more rare. And depending on what you're talking about, that's either a good thing or a bad thing. For calling this IQ, then if you're 3 standard deviations above the mean, you're really different. You're a very small subset of the population, but that's also really good. It means you're really intelligent. So it doesn't have to be bad. So if you don't like pictures, there it is. Without the curve drawn on there. All right. Y'all might remember this. Showed up on 3 of my tests. So if you don't remember that, smile and nod like you did. So the top one there is just talking about the normal distribution in terms of standard deviations away from the mean. If you go down to the z-score one, the z-scores look just the same as standard deviation there. So they just go up 1, 2, 3, 4, or go down -1, -2, -3, 4. So t-scores, what's the mean for t-scores? 50. Yay, somebody remember. Standard, yes, right. Standard deviation of 10. So 50 is considered smack dab in the middle, the most average you can be. And as you move in increments of 10 in either direction, you're getting more and more different. T-scores show up on a lot of the tests that we use. So, that's one that you definitely want to commit to memory. Deviation IQ, kind of a weird way to talk about it. Also, people just call it the IQ scores. But officially, for your test purposes, deviation IQ is the scale that we use for pretty much every single IQ test on the market these days. 100 is the mean, standard deviation of 15. So as you move up and down, it's increments of 15. Make sense? All right. Make sure you know it. Bivariate distribution is just a fancy way of saying we're comparing 2 sets of data. It's another one of those words that shows up on these kinds of tests. Baseline. So you remember when we're looking at data sets, we look at them on X and Y axis there. The baseline is the abscissa, and the vertical line is called the ordinate. That's just algebra or whatever math class that was, should have been in. So if you see those words, that's what that is. Mathematical correlations. Whenever we're talking about correlations, whether we're talking about them in this class or as your rest of that methods of research class, we're always talking about a small r is the descriptor for it. So, and everybody can pull this back from undergrad, but I'm going to say it anyway. Correlation does not imply causation. So because the temperature goes up, as ice cream sales go up, the murder rate increases. The murder, ice cream sales do not cause murder. So, all right. It has, more, but they are correlated. All right. Measures of central tendency. Another one I hope that is so drilled into you at this point that it just comes super easy. Make sure you know those. Those will certainly be there in some way. Sadly, you'll probably only get one question related to that. But mean and mode. You need to know those. All right. Range, nothing fancy here. We're just talking about the range of the scores. What's the lowest score to the highest score? So quartiles, just think about it. Quarter. Quartiles just means dividing it up into 4 equal parts. So the first quartile would be 0 to 25. The second quartile would be 26 to 50. It's just another way to divide data. But if you hear quartile ranges and all of that, that's what we're talking about. It's just dividing the data into 4 sets. Variance, you've gotten words there describing what that formula is. You're probably not going to be required to know the formula. When I took it, I don't remember there being any formulas on there way back when. It's been a minute since I took that. But I don't think that you're going to be required to know the formulas. You just need to understand what it's about. And the idea of variance, we're describing how spread out is our data. How much does it spread out over the mean? If you want to say it in fancy statistical ways, that's how you say it. Standard deviation is we just take that variance formula and we take the square root of it. What that does is it gives us the best way to indicate how our data point compares to the mean. It's the easiest, the best indicator of central tendency. That's a good way to say it for a licensure exam kind of question. It's the most reliable way to describe variability. That's why we just have those slides talking about how many standard deviation things were from the normal curve. So, if you love formulas, there it is. I doubt you're going to have to memorize it, but it's there for you. All right, positively skewed and negatively skewed. This is one of those things that doesn't seem to make sense in my brain, so I have to look at it each time. But positively skewed means that the majority of the scores are at the lower end of their range. And negatively skewed means that the majority of the scores are in the upper range. So if you're putting this on a graph, you're plotting all your scores out, you've got, for your positively skewed here, all your, oops, it changed, it didn't let me use my laser pointer, sorry. You've got all those scores heaped up on the lower end. Because you remember where the X and Y axis intersect, that's 0. So the majority of those scores are on the low end. So the positive is on the tail end. So we're kind of describing the tail of the data is how I think about it. But standard error of measurement. Now you remember when we do any kind of these assessments, there's always some sort of error, right? We can't do things perfectly. It's just not possible. Something's going to get in there and mess with how accurate our data is. So there are fancy statistical ways of figuring out how much our data is affected by that. Q and standard error measured here. So we're trying to figure out how accurate or inaccurate a single test score is. And that's what this formula does. And we can use this to create a confidence interval in terms of we know with pretty decent confidence that this person's score is actually within these 2 ranges. So like if I give an IQ test and I can say to that person, today you scored a 100. And I can say with 95% certainty that your score is going to fall somewhere between a 97 and 107. That's probably not accurate math there, but somewhere in that range. And so that lets me know that if they were to take the test multiple times, we could say, we're pretty sure it's going to fall somewhere in that range there because of this formula. If you love formulas, there's the formula. So there it is with a whisk. So we know just because the manual tells us some of these numbers, so we can calculate the standard error of measurement. And so if we had 100 on the whisk, we could add 5 and subtract 5, and we'd have that confidence interval with one standard interval, or one interval of that standard error of measurement, which would give us a 67% confidence band. A 95% confidence would put us at 1.96. So you just do the math out more. The neat thing is you don't have to really do the math these days. Any computer scoring program, they say, what confidence do you want, the interval do you want to use? And you click 67, 95, 99. Pretty much everybody uses 95 for most things. Because statistically, we know that that means we're pretty sure of our range there. But, so again, that's just a way for us to know how sure we can be about that score that we have. All right. So getting back to using this in counseling, the primary use there is to make those informed decisions. We should always keep in mind that this, when we're giving assessments, how is this going to serve the client? How is this beneficial to them? There are other therapists out there that get into this mode of everybody every time gets this, no matter what, and because it helps kind of bring that bottom line up a little bit and helps pay for the license. I know that's not the way y'all will operate. You're going to think about your clients, and I'm going to give a depression inventory because I'm worried about depression with this client. I don't think this client needs anything other than the interview process. They don't need the paper and pencil computerized tests. You're going to make those conscious decisions of what's best for them. All right. Again, let's drive home that point. The person isn't measured. We're describing characteristics or traits about them. The purpose of this testing is to answer questions that we have about the client, both for ourselves and especially for the client's benefit there. So again, measurement can be through observations, through rating scales, through interview process. We can either be using norm referenced or criterion referenced measurements. So again, norm reference, you're comparing to a normative sample. Criterion, you're comparing to a cutoff score. Is this person depressed? Did they meet enough of the characteristics to be depressed? Or comparing a t-score and the norm reference. So, all right. Standardized tests. Remember, we give our tests in a standardized way. When they create these tests, they create a way to administer these tests. When you buy the test, you purchase a manual as a part of that. And with that manual, it tells you the words to say. It tells you how to answer clients' questions associated with that test. It tells you when you can, what you can and can't say. So you want to administer the test in the same way to limit the amount of error, to increase the validity of the test that you gave and the reliability. And they're always scored the same way. It's less likely that you're going to come up with a creative way of scoring something, but use the manualized format. So, all right. This is just breaking that down further. I don't need to read that to you. All right. We've, I think, already hit on this a bit, but a standardized test is one that's going to yield raw scores, and then we're going to apply those scores to the bell curve, which is going to give us standard scores, and then we're going to use the established mean and standard deviation that the researchers that created the test have put in the manual for us, and we can just usually look at a table in that manual or use the computer program to figure out how normal or abnormal that score is. Quantitative, qualitative, those will be terms that show up probably. Quantitative is how much, how many. Qualitative is how good. Aptitude tests. Aptitude is predicting future behavior. Achievement test is measuring how much knowledge you already have. So you think about most of the tests that you have taken in graduate school have really been about achievement. How much have you learned in the process? A subjective test relies more on the clinician's opinion of what correct is, versus an objective test. There's already a predetermined scale that you're applying that to. Generally, we lean more towards using more objective tests, especially if you're talking about trying to present information in a court. They tend to be more in favor of objective test measures. There are still a lot of really good, more subjective test measures, especially when you get into personality testing, which is the projective personality tests are more subjective sometimes in the way that they are scored, and can still be very valuable.
The medical status, the mental status exam, subjective.
Yeah, there's still subjectivity to rating people using the mental status exam. You've learned categories and you've learned examples of what that might look like, just like you would with a personality test that's a projective test. But you're still having to make that interpretation to some degree. We have forced choice tests, which is what y'all will be taking soon. You are selecting A, B, C, or D. You don't get to, it's not fill in the blank. You have your dichotomous tests, which break that down to true or false, 1 or 2. Yeah. You have a normative format where you're comparing your score to others who have taken the test before, which is a lot of what we will use in counseling. There's the ipsative format where you're comparing their traits to themselves. So it's more of an internal comparison. So personality testing tends to be more, have some ipsative testing associated with that. Speed tests versus power tests. This is another thing that will likely show up. Speed tends to be, for measuring speed, how quickly someone thinks, like if we're talking about processing speed, or doing math drills and things like that. They're typically not very challenging questions in terms of the individual questions, but there's so many of them that there's no way that the person's going to be able to finish them all. So the idea is just how many can you get, is what speed is about. Versus power is measuring the maximum amount of knowledge. So it's getting the most out of a question that you possibly can. So within power tests, you have the spiral test concept, where as the first question you answer is a little bit easier, then as you answer more and more questions, it gets harder and harder and harder and harder. So then there are other tests that will be called cyclical tests, which you have different sections that are all spirals. So you section A, you start off easy, and then it gets harder and harder and harder and harder. You finish section A, you move section B, it starts off easy again, and another category, it gets harder and harder and harder as you go through it. So parallel forms, equivalent forms, alternate forms, all the same thing. So if you see those things showing up, just think, you're talking about having 2 versions of the same test. So sometimes you're going to have a client walk into your office and you're going to say, I want to assess you for this, and I want to use this test. They say, oh, I took that last week. And say, oh, I can't give that one to you again. So it's good to have an alternate form, or a different version of the same test. And especially in achievement testing, but and other applications is there too. The test publisher will provide an A form and a B form, a red form and a blue form, and they are statistically equivalent forms, is what they found out, because they've used a lot of testing to figure that out. So you can feel confident in giving this alternate form to compare it to a previous form. Reliability is consistency. So when we're talking about reliability, we're talking about consistency. If we give this test over and over again, how likely are we to get the same results? So we want a high level of reliability in the test that we purchase. Yeah.
How do you say that word that was on the same slide with normative?
Ipsative. Ipsative. Yeah. And again, you know, trying to make sure I throw out the fun, hard words just to make sure that they're there. Yeah, I'm not sure that one was on our exam, but you're getting the bonus level here because you're all so smart. I know that you can handle it. So hang in there with me. We don't have too much longer. You can make it, and I can too. All right. So when we're looking at our test and we're talking about reliability, it's how consistent this measure is. There are different ways of measuring reliability, but in general, as we increase the number of items on a test, it increases the reliability of the test. Decreasing the number of items on a test decreases the reliability of the test. So more items, you have more opportunity to get that information, have it be accurate, more and reliable and consistent. So a test can be reliable but not valid, but a test cannot be valid without being reliable. That's totally an NC kind of question. It was on my test too. But so just think about that. So it can give you the same results over and over again and be very reliable, but it can be wrong. But it's giving you that same result over and over again. So it would not be a valid answer, but it could be reliable. So that would not be a test you would want to use if it was that way. Test retest reliability. You're talking about the correlation between the scores from the same person taking a test 2 different times. So you've given them the same person, the same test, and you're comparing the results. How similar are they? The more similar those numbers are, the higher the test retest reliability. All right, which tells us, gives us more confidence in the individual's responses, as well as it gives us more confidence in the inventory itself, depending on what you're measuring. Alternate form reliability, parallel form reliability, you're comparing 2 equivalent forms of the same test. You've got the A version and the B version, and you've given them to the same person, and you're comparing those to see, is this a valid alternate form of this test? You would hope that they would be very similar. Split half reliability, we're taking the test, cutting it in half, not just a fancy name. All right. Now, you're trying to get these into basically 2 equivalent halves and compare those halves. So Cruder-Richardson, y'all remember this a little bit? Going, whoa, why did I have to remember that before? So there's the KR20. This is a type of reliability for dichotomous testing, true-false testing. So the coefficient alpha is a way for testing reliability in tests where there's multiple scored items. It's not dichotomous, not true-false. So again, these are things that you're probably, unless you're getting into test construction and research post-licensure, get it in your brain for now. Yeah, all right. Inter-rater reliability, inter-score reliability. This is talking about when you have 2 people, 2 clinicians like yourself, rating someone. So say you're both sitting in a classroom watching Johnny, and you're measuring out-of-seat behavior. And so you're each putting a little check mark every time Johnny gets out of his seat. And then you compare what you got at the end using math. And you say, how did we do? How alike are our observations of Johnny? You want to have high inter-rater reliability, right? So
they're interchangeable.
yes, yeah. Standard error of measurement also falls in here. Again, it's talking about how accurate or inaccurate a particular score is. All right, correlation coefficients. Remember Pearson's R, the little R that we were talking about earlier? Okay. Perfect correlation, perfect positive correlation is 1. Perfect negative correlation is a -1. And then no correlation at all is 0. This is all using the Pearson's R, talking about correlation coefficients there. So if you're looking at 2 sets of data and how they're related. All right, so when we're doing this, there's an even less accurate way that we use at the beginning is the scatter plot. This is just as simple as you have your X and Y axis and you just are putting your data points just where they fall on that X and Y axis. But it's a visual way to look at it and see how things start to group together before you start applying these other statistical methods to figure out how close they actually are. So you can just get an eyeball representation of where it's at. All right, validity. So we've determined that our test that we're spending all this money on and using with our clients is reliable, meaning that it'll give us the same results over and over again. But we want to know, does it actually measure what it says it measures? Does it really measure depression? That's what validity is. So we have base validity or logical validity, which means just it looks like it measures what it purports to measure. You can look at that and say, that looks to be accurate. Let's talk with base validity, what we're talking about. Construct validity is it measuring a theoretical construct that we're talking about, like depression or anxiety or intelligence. Content validity is the extent to which the test items measure the content that the test is supposed to measure. So this is breaking it down into those items there. Concurrent validity is the extent to which the test measures or diagnoses an existing situation, status like depression or anxiety. It's how well it measures that diagnosis. Predictive validity, how well can it predict in the future? How accurately can it guess what diagnosis or a person's going to have, or how they're going to do in school? Will they or will they not pass the NCE? Yeah, you will. So, with validity, we also get into the prediction tables there, your type 1, type 2, your alpha error, your beta error. There's lots of different ways. Remember this table here? So when you're making predictions about a group, you can make valid or accurate decisions, and you can make inaccurate decisions. So if you reject the data, and that is accurate, then it is a valid rejection. If you reject the data, but you should have accepted it, then that's a type 1 error or an alpha error. If you accept the data and you should have accepted it because that was accurate, then that is a valid, accurate answer. If you accept the data but you should have rejected it, that's a type 2 or a beta error. Again, that's one of those things you just kind of think through, draw it out on, on a piece of paper, scrap paper, to kind of help your brain go through that when you get to that part of the test. Code of ethics. I'm sure Dr. Doverspike didn't talk anything about ethics. Did he talk a lot about ethics in testing? No? Okay. All right. All right. Yes. Thanks, Bill. All right. So a lot of this is hopefully very common sense to you guys because y'all are so super ethical anyway, but we're going to talk about it. So we want to think about the client's cultural context and their background and whether or not the test that we're using takes that into account. We want to be choosing in a test and assessing the client with their well-being on the forefront there. So we're talking about the 2014 Aca Code of Ethics here, and those are just the section numbers. I doubt seriously that you're going to be asked to know section numbers. I think more likely they're going to want you to be able to just understand the ethical concept and apply that that data, unless Dr. Doverspike told you differently for the other ethics. So the primary purpose, of testing in here is to provide us with more information to help the client and help us in our decision making, help the client in their decision making, help in our treatment planning and goal setting with the clients, and in forensic settings too. Sometimes we get called into court. We're going to have qualitative and quantitative methods that we use. Client welfare is on the forefront always. So this idea of do no harm, think what can I do? How can I help the client in this process? And that the client has a right to the results of the assessment that you do with them. And the interpretations that you make based on those results. So if you give a test and you decide that wasn't so useful, or I'm not sure I feel comfortable talking about this with a client, withholding that is not a good thing. That's not an ethical thing. You need, if you're entering into testing with a client, they have the right to know how they did and what your interpretations are based off of that. And our delivery, remember, needs to be ethical in itself as well. We don't throw a bunch of statistical words and things at them that they wouldn't be able to understand or interpret accurately. We use language that is appropriate to explain the results and explain our interpretations to them.
But wouldn't you have to identify who the client is, if the client is an employer or?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Then you're not necessarily sharing it with the person in front of you.
Absolutely. Yes, it's a good point. There are times that you'll have people that are sent by their employer to be tested, and then the employer is the one paying for the assessment. So the employer has the right to the interpretations and the results, not the person sitting across from you, unless the employer makes that explicit.
But you do tell the client, right? I mean,
you
tell the
talk,
person that you're testing that that's the case.
Oh, absolutely. Before you start the testing, you want to.
Issue is that you tell them how it's used and what they have right to.
Before you start the testing, you have to explain to the client, this situation is different because your employer is paying for it. Coca-Cola, Chick-fil-A is paying for you to be tested. Coca-Cola, Chick-fil-A has the right to these results. They decide whether or not the results are shared with you. And then the client can choose not to, or the person that you are testing, because they would not be the client, the paying person is the client, could choose whether or not the person sitting across from you could choose to engage in the testing based off that knowledge and give their assent, or could choose to walk out and leave. So,
what if the client mandates or a court mandates the person in front of you to take the test, and yet the person in front of you has to pay to take the test?
That's a sticky situation, but it's one, if it's court mandated, they still can choose not to come and do the assessment based off the court's mandate, which, whether that be financial or don't want to for whatever reason, but they're going to have to deal with the consequences.
And same thing with the employer.
Right.
If they're in trouble and they have to pay for an evaluation because they've been caught on this. I mean,
Right.
this is the situation. I'm actually, I need to look at my form. There's a client's rights to review that, because I think it says you have a right to see it. Nobody does, but nobody asks to see
The
this.
paying party has the right, or if we're talking about children, their parent or guardian figure, their legal guardian has the rights. So these are the sections of the Aca Code of Ethics that have to do specifically with testing. So we're going to be competent. We're going in our use and in our interpretation, which means different things for different tests. Some tests having competency really can be reading the manual, going through a very short learning process, and you're ready to go. You are competent to administer, a sentence completion test. Versus if you want to do the ADOS-2, which is an autism diagnostic instrument, it takes a long course that you go to, and then you're supervised for a year by someone who knows how to do this to make sure that you're doing it accurately. So there different tests have different levels that, of competency required. So you just need to be aware of what that is. And you need to be competent in your interpretation side as well. So if it's a level C test, meaning something that is administered by a psychologist, then you're going to want to yield to the psychologist making the interpretations, even if you have read and and understand the situation. It's better to encourage the client to go back to that psychologist for that aspect of the interpretation. Well, it talks about informed consent and the specifics there of making sure that our clients know why they're doing what they're doing and how it's going to be used for their benefit, and what dangers there might be in the assessment process. The release of information is the same as it is with other client data. You might have an employer or client that wants you to release the data to an employer, to a spouse, to another therapist, to a school system. You still have to fill out the release of information and be very careful about how you handle that information and protect it with just the same level of protection you would any client note. So, they have a right to an ethical and accurate diagnosis, that we're going to be culturally sensitive in the way that we choose our tests for them and interpret the tests that we use. We're going to just be thinking through all of the cultural data that goes along with that and biases that go with that. And sometimes it's appropriate not to diagnose. So, let's see. Oh, there we go. I forgot those slides were all there. So, but there's also when tests become obsolete, which generally is a year after the new version comes out, they're considered obsolete. That means you have to quit using it. You have to start using the new version, unless there is a good ethical reason not to use the new version. If the norms become just grossly outdated and they don't update the norms, you still ethically have to make the decision of, I don't think that this is appropriate to use anymore. This is obsolete. The last time this was normed was in the 80s, and it's not the 80s anymore. It would be. All right, so let's see. We've kind of hit all that. And just thinking about if you're in a forensic setting, who your obligation is to, so who's the client, who's has a right to the information, who doesn't. Remembering things like lawyers write really scary looking letters that are pretty much meaningless. They're just being threatening and bullies. And it's good for you to have a lawyer that you can go to and say, is this one of those times where they're just being threatening? Or, you know, did I miss the part where it said subpoenaed by a judge? And I have to release my information here. So there can be some really scary letters. So, but thinking about who has the right to the information, who doesn't. Thinking about the timeliness of the evaluations and getting it done so that it helps the client as much as possible. Avoiding those dual relationships where it could be harmful to the client for you to be their evaluator or counselor. So practicing within the limits of your competence is a big one. That'll come up in some sort of way, I'm sure. But you know, again, you know, just make sure that if you're going to buy a test and start using a test, that you get whatever training you need to be competent in administering that test. All right. So I don't think they'll ask you if there's 7 major errors, but there you go. You've got it just in case. But you know, this is just again going through. You know, talking about these things that we've already been talking about in another way. So there's been litigation and laws and things that were created from or that are associated with assessments and testing law. And so some of the big ones, the Civil Rights Act of 1991, this one outlawed discrimination in employment based off of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So there's previous versions of the Act you see there, but the latest version, 1991 there, that's something that is likely to show up. ADA, the Americans with Disability Act of 1990, another really big one, banning discrimination on employment and access to public services. And transportation, telecommunications, all of that based off both physical and mental disabilities there. So you can't discriminate if based off of mental disability or physical disability. These are all things that we just kind of know, but this is the act associated with it. IDEA, 2004. This is the one that gives students and the right to a fair and appropriate education. To if you have some sort of disability, the school system has to work with you to provide you an education in such a way that it levels that playing ground, that they that playing field, that makes it so that you get that appropriate education. So when you're working with clients that have severe attention difficulties, you know, you hear about things like extended time or testing in a less distracting environment. That's because of this. So, all right. And each state has to have a comprehensive system to identify this. So another thing that our clients sometimes don't know is that whether your kid's in public school or private school, it doesn't matter. If you are a resident in the state of Georgia and you are paying taxes, well, even if you're not paying your taxes, if you can send your kid to the local public school that you would be districted for, and they can be evaluated within the school system to help them determine whether or not accommodations would be appropriate. So if you have a private school parent and they're saying, well, yeah, but my kid doesn't go to the public school still has to offer that to them for free. It's part of your tax dollars. The downside to that is that the system is incredibly slow because they are overworked and understaffed, and so it takes a very long time. Most recently, folks have been talking to me that it was going to take a year for their kid to be fully evaluated. So they wind up coming and paying a private psychologist. So,
in Tennessee,
Uh-huh.
because it was recent, because we use the Tennessee law is a little different.
Mhm.
So the different states handle that different, but because
Okay.
mine were in private schools,
Uh-huh.
they had a moratorium on testing kids in private.
So they wouldn't do it for.
And they wouldn't do it, and I issued an appeal.
Yeah.
Because I said they're coming out based on financial issues, and they were, what they were telling us was they're gonna put them in regular classrooms, and
Mhm.
then they would have to be here for 6 months and then get a referral.
Right.
But it took, and encouraging your clients to fill it, because we got a waiver based on the appeals. There was a moratorium on testing because of finances and needs,
Yeah.
that nobody in the private school system, even though you pay the taxes.
Right.
That just that knowledge that you can encourage and appeal for
Exactly.
your clients is really helpful, because we appealed it just because opportunity.
It-
We're able to
And
get what we needed.
and there are client advocates. Their job is, they're lawyers basically, that go and fight and make appeals and things like that. That is their entire job. Is
Because we offered to pay for the private, the testing private, and the school system told us they wouldn't accept that it has to be their own in order to receive the services. So
Yeah.
just being an advocate for your client.
Yeah.
Looking to appealing and not.
It's unlikely you would run into that situation in Georgia, but yeah, that's good to know that there's a difference there. Yeah, thank you. Oh, I didn't talk about FERPA. FERPA, this is saying that every parent and student have the right to inspect their school records, to know how things are going, what their grades are. So if you're under the age of 18, that means the parent can walk into the school and demand your report card and demand to know how things are going in the school, which is good. This is to encourage accountability. If you're over the age of 18, it gives you, the adult, the right to say, hey parents, you don't have the right to my grades anymore. But the idea is we're trying to protect student privacy while also holding school systems accountable. So HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. These are a group of standards that have been created to help protect patient information so that diagnoses and identifying information and things like that wouldn't be shared. A patient's information would not be shared without the client's knowledge, would not be shared in an inappropriate, unethical manner. So this is a way that a group of procedures to help us keep that information as protected as we can, and safeguarding the client's information. It goes down to all kinds of specifics, like the way that we keep information in our files themselves, the file cabinets, the locks on the door, having 2 locked doors. If you use, some sort of digital media, not putting things like birth dates and social security numbers and diagnosis and names and things like that out there. So we survived. That was, I don't know, those of you, some of you are old enough to know the old Micro Machines commercials where the guy talks a million miles a minute. So it's kind of what that felt like for me. There's a ton of information here. Again, I encourage you, if there's something that you still have a question about, you can ask me now. You can ask me afterwards. You can email me. These are some of the things that Dr. McGee and I think are things that are likely to show up on an NCE kind of CPCE sort of test, which is why they were included in this. I wouldn't call this exhaustive.
I would call it exhausting.
It was exhausting, I will give you that. It's absolutely exhausting. When it comes to things like names of people, the father of, the first of kind of things, those are things that are likely to show up. In my experience in taking these kinds of tests is it hasn't been a ton of that, but there's always some of that. When you get to the individual instruments and things like that, they're more likely to expect you to recognize something is in the family of intelligence tests, like a Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children is an intelligence test, or the Rorschach is associated with personality testing and is a projective measure. You know, if they got that specific, that's how they're not going to ask you what the subtests of the WISC-4 are compared to the WISC-5. That's not something they're likely to get into, that kind of minutia. They are T-scores and Z-scores and all that good stuff. There's likely to be something associated with that. But remember, this is a ton of information. There's not enough questions on the test to cover all of this. But historically, students in this program have done well on the items associated with this content area, is the feedback that I've been given. And ethics, just to kind of help you feel a little less stressed, because I know that's another one that has a lot of detail. Just go through, read through the stuff, the things that I was talking about today. If it just didn't ring bells, read through that stuff again, contact me. I'm, again, CAllen at Richmont. Make sure you don't put the mail in there, because then it goes to Chris, who's a student, and that one, So CAllen at Richmont. I'm happy to answer any of those. Let's see. You'll notice I didn't really get into a lot of test naming, because that's probably not as important for you guys as because those constantly change. So licensure exams recognize that, and so knowing what is current in 2017 isn't really that pertinent for 4 years from now. So just be thinking about those kinds of things as you study, is the big concepts and all that. What questions? I'm sure that was all easy, you remember it all, but humor me. Really? Not a line? Everybody's like, we're done. We actually are time-wise, I think. I think we're supposed to